Hey there, tonight we're diving into something particularly grim from Imperial China, a world where desperate families made choices that would make modern horror writers weep. We are talking about the eunuch system, and trust me, you probably won't survive the mental imagery of the next 2 hours without questioning humanity's capacity for cruelty. So now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. All right, you are an 8-year-old boy in the Ming Dynasty, Old China, maybe around 1450, and your family is drowning in debt. The harvest failed again. The tax collectors are circling like vultures, and your parents are having whispered conversations that stop abruptly when you enter the room. Then, one morning, a stranger appears at your door, well-dressed, soft-spoken, with hands that seem too clean for honest work. He's a talent scout of sorts, though his particular talent involves identifying which children might survive having their genitals removed with a rusty blade. Welcome to the recruitment process for Imperial China's eunuch system, where desperation met opportunity in the most horrifying way imaginable. The procedure itself was called purification, which has to rank among history's most cynical euphemisms. Imagine calling waterboarding enhanced relaxation, and you're getting close to the linguistic gymnastics involved. The actual operation was performed by street-level surgeons who'd learned their trade through trial and error, mostly error, judging by the mortality rates. These weren't trained physicians with medical degrees hanging on their walls. These were essentially butchers who'd figured out how to remove male genitalia without killing the patient more than, say, 60% of the time. The tools were about what you'd expect from a back alley operation in pre-modern China. A curved knife, often rusty and rarely sterilized, served as the primary instrument. Some practitioners used a special clamp to crush the blood vessels before cutting, which sounds almost thoughtful until you realize this was done without any form of anesthesia stronger than rice wine. The entire procedure took place on a wooden table, with the boy's legs held apart by assistants, while the surgeon worked by candlelight, or whatever natural light filtered through grimy windows. Here's where it gets particularly nightmarish. The operation removed everything. We're not talking about a simple castration that left some parts intact. The entire genital package was sliced away in one go, leaving what practitioners delicately called a smooth surface. The wound was then cauterized with boiling oil or sealed with a mixture of crushed herbs and animal fat that probably contained more bacteria than a medieval plague pit. But wait, there's more. After the cutting came the plugging. A metal tube or wooden peg was inserted into the urethra to prevent it from sealing shut during the healing process. This tube had to remain in place for weeks, during which time urination became an exercise in pure agony. Many boys died from infection, shock, or simple inability to urinate. Those who survived this initial phase faced weeks of fever, delirium, and pain so intense that many begged for death. The recovery period lasted about a month, during which the boy was kept in a sealed room with no access to water. Yes, you heard that right, no water. The theory was that limiting fluid intake would reduce the risk of the wound reopening during urination. In practice, this meant that many boys died of dehydration even after surviving the surgery itself. It's hard to imagine a more efficient system for maximizing human suffering while technically keeping people alive. Families paid handsomely for this service, often borrowing money they'd never be able to repay. The going rate for castration in the Ming Dynasty was roughly equivalent to a year's wages for a typical farmer. Parents convinced themselves they were giving their sons a chance at advancement within the imperial system, where eunuchs could theoretically rise to positions of significant power. What they were actually doing was condemning their children to a lifetime of physical pain, psychological trauma, and social ostracism. The practitioners themselves occupied a strange niche in Chinese society. They were simultaneously essential and reviled, providing a service that fed the imperial appetite for castrated servants while being considered untouchable by respectable society. Many were former eunuchs themselves, having learned the trade out of economic necessity. There's something particularly twisted about a system that forces its victims to become perpetrators, creating an endless cycle of mutilation and trauma. Different regions developed their own variations on the procedure. In some areas, the entire operation was performed in a single cut. In others, it was done in stages over several days, presumably to maximize the suffering or perhaps to give the family multiple opportunities to change their minds and doom their child to a lingering death. Some practitioners claimed their methods were more humane than others, which is rather like claiming your particular method of throwing people off cliffs is more considerate than your competitors. The survival rates varied wildly, depending on the skill of the operator, the health of the child, and simple luck. In good years, with experienced practitioners, perhaps 4 out of 10 boys might survive. In bad years, or with inexperienced operators, the numbers dropped to 1 or 2 out of 10. These weren't statistics kept in official records. Mind you, they're estimates based on the occasional diary entry or court document that mentioned the difficulties of maintaining adequate supplies of eunuch servants. What's particularly haunting is that the boys who survived often thanked their families for the opportunity. Stockholm Syndrome doesn't adequately describe this psychological adaptation. These children, permanently altered and forever changed, convinced themselves that their suffering had been a gift. The alternative, acknowledging that their parents had mutilated them for money, was perhaps too horrible to contemplate. The blade's edge had many victims, but the survivors faced a different kind of death entirely. They traded their physical integrity for a chance at palace life, not yet understanding that what awaited them inside the forbidden city would make the castration itself seem like a gentle introduction to their new existence. The boys who emerged from these procedures, if they emerged at all, were forever changed in ways that went far beyond the physical. They'd been initiated into a brotherhood of suffering that would define every remaining day of their lives. The scar tissue would heal eventually. The psychological wounds would fester for decades. And this was just the beginning. The blade's edge was merely the entrance exam to a world of systematic dehumanization that would make the castration itself seem almost merciful by comparison. These broken children, barely alive and forever altered, were about to discover that surviving the cut was actually the easy part. the real nightmare was just beginning. So you've survived the rusty blade and the month of dehydration. Congratulations. You're now officially less than human in the eyes of Chinese society. Remember that 8-year-old boy from our last conversation? Well, he's about to discover that the castration was merely his entrance fee to a lifetime membership in society's most exclusive club. People everyone pretends don't exist, while simultaneously depending on them completely. The moment a boy recovered from his castration, his family held what amounted to a funeral for who he used to be. This wasn't metaphorical. Actual mourning rituals were performed. His name was struck from the family genealogy. His place at family gatherings was removed, and any hopes his parents might have harbored about grandchildren evaporated like morning mist. He was simultaneously their son and not their son, a walking contradiction that made everyone uncomfortable. The newly castrated boy faced an immediate practical problem. Where exactly does a eunuch live? He couldn't return to normal family life because he was no longer considered fully human. Chinese society operated on strict gender roles, and eunuchs existed in a liminal space that made everyone nervous. They weren't men, obviously, but they certainly weren't women either. They occupied a third category that had no comfortable place in the social order, like a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit in any room of the house. Most eunuchs were sold to middlemen who specialized in training them for palace service. These training houses were essentially finishing schools for the formerly human, designed to strip away any remaining traces of individual personality and replace them with the perfect servility required for imperial service. The curriculum included walking silently, speaking only when spoken to, anticipating needs before they were expressed, and most importantly, becoming completely invisible while remaining constantly available. The physical transformation continued long after the initial surgery. Castration before puberty affected the entire body's development in ways that medieval Chinese medicine barely understood. These boys grew tall and gangly, with unusually long limbs and soft, hairless skin. Their voices remained high and childlike, creating an unsettling effect when combined with their adult-sized bodies. They developed a particular way of moving, gliding, rather than walking, that maximized silence while maintaining the ability to appear instantly when summoned. The psychological adaptation was perhaps even more dramatic. Imagine being told from childhood that you're simultaneously invaluable and worthless, that your entire purpose in life is to serve people who consider you subhuman, and that your greatest achievement would be to become so perfectly servile that you disappear entirely as an individual. The mental gymnastics required to maintain sanity under these conditions produced a particular type of personality, obsequious on the surface, calculating underneath, with an undercurrent of rage that could never be safely expressed. Palace eunuchs developed their own elaborate hierarchy, partly because humans need social structure, and partly because it was the only way to maintain some semblance of dignity in an inherently degrading situation. At the bottom were the newly castrated boys, who spent their first years doing the most menial tasks, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, and serving as human furniture when their superiors needed something to lean on. Above them were the more experienced eunuchs who had learned to navigate palace politics, and at the top were the rare few who had gained the trust of imperial family members. The initiation process for new eunuchs was deliberately humiliating. Senior eunuchs would inspect the castration scars to ensure the job had been done properly. Apparently, there were cases of boys attempting to fake their castration with creative surgery that left some parts intact. Those caught with incomplete castrations faced immediate recastration, performed by palace officials with even less concern for the victim's survival than the original street surgeons. New eunuchs were also required to prove their loyalty through increasingly degrading tasks. They might be ordered to clean the emperor's chamber pots with their bare hands, or to remain motionless in uncomfortable positions for hours while serving as living decorations during imperial banquets. The message was clear: you are not human, you have no dignity, and your comfort is irrelevant to your function. The living conditions for lower-level eunuchs were appalling even by medieval standards. They slept in cramped dormitories with dozens of other eunuchs, sharing space that would have been considered inadequate for animals. Privacy was non-existent. Personal possessions were forbidden, and even basic hygiene was regulated by palace officials who seemed to take pleasure in making their lives as miserable as possible. Food was another instrument of control. Eunuchs received carefully measured rations designed to keep them alive, but never satisfied. The meals were deliberately bland and repetitive, consisting mainly of rice, vegetables, and occasional scraps of meat that were usually on the verge of spoiling. Senior eunuchs ate better, of course, but even they never received the quality of food served to the lowest-ranking palace guards. Perhaps most cruelly, new eunuchs were forced to observe the imperial family's daily life while being constantly reminded that they could never participate in it. They watched the emperor's children play, saw the empress's joy at her newborn babies, and witnessed the complex relationships between husbands and wives, all while being permanently excluded from these fundamental human experiences. It was like being forced to watch a feast while starving, except the feast lasted for decades. The training process also included lessons in reading and writing, not out of any concern for the eunuch's intellectual development, but because literate servants were more useful. Many eunuchs became surprisingly well-educated, though their knowledge was always in service to others. They learned to compose poetry, not for their own pleasure, but to ghostwrite verses for imperial family members who wanted to appear cultured. They studied history and philosophy, not for personal enrichment, but to better understand the political currents that might affect their survival. Some eunuchs discovered they had a talent for administrative work and began to carve out small niches of influence within the palace bureaucracy. These were the ones who might eventually rise to positions of real power, though that power always came with the understanding that it could be revoked instantly if they displeased their superiors. Even the most successful eunuchs remained fundamentally powerless, their influence entirely dependent on the whims of others. The social death that followed castration was perhaps more traumatic than the physical procedure itself. These boys went from being someone's beloved son to being no one's anything, floating through life without the anchors of family, marriage, or children that gave other people meaning and purpose. They existed in service to a system that considered them necessary but fundamentally disposable, like expensive tools that could be discarded when they wore out. And yet, somehow, they adapted. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for normalizing even the most abnormal circumstances, and these castrated boys learned to find meaning in their constrained existence. They formed bonds with fellow eunuchs, developed skills that gave them value, and occasionally even found moments of genuine happiness in their service to the imperial family. But the adaptation came at a terrible cost. To survive psychologically, they had to accept their own dehumanization so completely that it became part of their identity. They learned to take pride in their perfect servility, to find satisfaction in their invisibility, and to measure their worth by how completely they could efface themselves in service to others. The blade had claimed their bodies, but palace life was claiming their souls, and they were only getting started. Welcome to the Forbidden City, where our castrated protagonists have finally arrived at their ultimate destination, a gilded prison that makes Alcatraz look like a vacation resort. Remember that boy who survived the rusty blade and the social funeral. He's about to discover that all his suffering so far has been merely preparation for the main event. Life as a forgotten soul in the most powerful household in China. The Forbidden City housed roughly 3,000 eunuchs during the Ming Dynasty, creating what was essentially a small town populated entirely by castrated men. Imagine the psychological dynamics of a community where literally everyone has been mutilated, traumatized, and stripped of their fundamental humanity, then forced to compete for the scraps of dignity thrown down from the imperial table. It's like a social experiment designed by someone with a particularly dark sense of humor and unlimited funding. These eunuchs occupied a space that defied easy categorization in Chinese society. They were servants, obviously, but servants with access to the most intimate details of imperial life. They knew which concubines the emperor favored, which princes were falling out of favor, and which political decisions were being made behind closed doors. This knowledge made them simultaneously invaluable and dangerous, exactly the sort of contradiction that kept everyone, including the eunuchs themselves, perpetually on edge. The daily routine of a palace eunuch began before dawn and ended well after midnight. Assuming it ended at all, they were expected to be available at all hours for whatever whims might strike the imperial family. A typical day might involve dressing the emperor, serving his meals, transcribing his correspondence, managing his appointments, organizing his entertainment, and then standing silently in corners during private family moments in case someone needed a cup of tea or a foot massage. What made this particularly maddening was the arbitrary nature of imperial demands. The emperor might decide at 3 in the morning that he wanted to hear a specific poem, requiring eunuchs to wake up scholars, locate the appropriate text, and arrange an impromptu literary performance. Or an imperial concubine might demand that her rooms be completely redecorated because she'd had a dream about yellow chrysanthemums, sending dozens of eunuchs scrambling to source flowers, fabric, and furniture in the middle of the night. The living paradox of eunuch existence was most apparent in their relationship with the imperial women. They were the only men allowed in the inner palace, precisely because they weren't really men anymore. This gave them unprecedented access to the empress, concubines, and imperial daughters, relationships that could be incredibly influential, but were always built on the foundation of their own emasculation. They might become trusted confidants, almost like sisters to the imperial women, but this intimacy was only possible because everyone understood they were sexually neutered. Some eunuchs became remarkably skilled at navigating these complex relationships. They learned to read the subtle signals that indicated which way the political winds were blowing, which imperial children were rising or falling in favor, and which palace intrigues were worth joining versus which ones were career suicide. The successful ones developed an almost supernatural ability to be present when they were needed and invisible when they weren't, a skill that required constant vigilance and psychological flexibility that would have impressed professional spies. But here's where it gets particularly twisted. The more successful a eunuch became, the more isolated he became from his fellow eunuchs. Success in palace politics required a certain ruthlessness that often involved betraying other eunuchs, reporting their mistakes to superiors, or positioning yourself as more loyal than your competitors. The system was designed to prevent eunuchs from forming lasting alliances that might threaten imperial power, so it actively encouraged them to undermine each other. The psychological toll of this constant performance was enormous. Eunuchs had to maintain multiple personalities: the perfect servant for their superiors, the calculating competitor for their peers, and somewhere deep inside, whatever remained of their original selves. Many developed what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, compartmentalizing their personalities so completely that they seemed to become different people depending on who they were interacting with. The more perceptive eunuchs understood that they were living symbols of imperial power, walking demonstrations of what the emperor could do to anyone who displeased him. Their castration wasn't just about creating reliable servants. It was about displaying the absolute authority of the throne. Every time a court official looked at a eunuch, he was reminded that the emperor had the power to take everything away, including the most fundamental aspects of masculine identity. This symbolic function extended to their appearance and behavior. Eunuchs were required to dress in ways that emphasized their ambiguous gender status, not quite masculine clothing, but not feminine either. They wore their hair in specific styles that marked them as neither fully male nor female. Their movements, their speech patterns, even their facial expressions were regulated to maintain their status as human symbols of imperial power. The knowledge that eunuchs accumulated made them simultaneously valuable and expendable. They knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, but this knowledge was also what made them dangerous to whoever happened to be in power. A eunuch who had served faithfully for decades could be executed overnight if political circumstances changed, simply because he knew too much about the previous regime. Yet some eunuchs managed to carve out genuine niches of influence within this impossible system. They became experts in particular areas: art collection, military strategy, diplomatic protocol, that made them difficult to replace. The smart ones cultivated relationships with multiple imperial family members, creating redundant sources of protection. The really smart ones learned to make themselves indispensable while never appearing to accumulate too much independent power. The strangest aspect of eunuch life was how they adapted to their permanent liminality. They created their own culture within the palace, with private jokes, shared references, and subtle forms of communication that allowed them to maintain some sense of community despite the competitive pressures. They developed elaborate etiquette systems for interacting with each other that acknowledged their shared trauma while maintaining the hierarchies necessary for palace function. Many eunuchs became genuinely devoted to the imperial family, not because they were naturally servile, but because devotion was the only psychologically sustainable response to their situation. The alternative, acknowledging that they'd been mutilated and enslaved for the entertainment of people who considered them subhuman, was too painful to contemplate. So they transformed their captivity into voluntary service, their powerlessness into chosen loyalty, and their degradation into sacred duty. The most successful eunuchs often outlasted the emperors they served, becoming institutional memory for the palace bureaucracy. They witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of imperial children, and the endless cycles of court intrigue that defined Chinese politics. In some ways, they became more permanent features of the Forbidden City than the imperial families they served. But permanence came at the cost of perpetual insecurity. Even the most powerful eunuchs lived with the knowledge that their influence was entirely derivative, dependent on the continued favor of people who could withdraw it at any moment. They were simultaneously at the center of imperial power and completely excluded from it, privy to the most important secrets, while remaining fundamentally powerless to act on that knowledge. The Forbidden City had consumed their identities as completely as the rusty blade had consumed their bodies. They had become perfect servants precisely because they had learned to serve so completely that they no longer existed as independent beings. And somehow, impossibly, many of them found ways to be content with this arrangement, which only made what came next even more horrifying. Picture the most toxic workplace you've ever encountered. Multiply it by the entire imperial bureaucracy of China. Then add the psychological damage of mass castration, and you're beginning to understand the internal politics among palace eunuchs. Remember our survivor from the Forbidden City. He's about to learn that his fellow victims can be far more dangerous than any emperor, because desperate people with nothing left to lose make remarkably creative enemies. The eunuch hierarchy wasn't just about rank. It was about survival in a system designed to pit the powerless against each other rather than against their oppressors. At the bottom were the newly castrated boys, still healing from their wounds and trying to figure out which end was up in their new existence. Above them were the junior eunuchs who'd learned the basic skills of palace service but hadn't yet distinguished themselves. Then came the senior eunuchs who'd managed to attach themselves to specific imperial family members. And at the very top were the handful who'd achieved genuine influence within the palace bureaucracy. But here's the delicious irony. Advancement through this hierarchy required eunuchs to become everything they'd originally been victimized for lacking. They had to be ruthless calculating, and willing to destroy other people to protect their own interests. The system had castrated them to make them safer servants, then rewarded them for developing the exact qualities that castration was supposed to eliminate. It's like removing someone's teeth to make them less dangerous, then giving prizes to whoever learns to bite most effectively with their gums. The competition began almost immediately after recovery from castration. New eunuchs were assigned to work groups where they were evaluated not just on their performance, but on their ability to outperform their peers. Supervisors deliberately created situations where eunuchs had to choose between helping a colleague and advancing their own position. The smart ones learned quickly that loyalty to fellow eunuchs was a luxury they couldn't afford. Information became the primary currency of eunuch politics. A junior eunuch who overheard gossip about an imperial concubine's pregnancy could trade that knowledge for better work assignments. Someone who noticed that a prince was showing signs of illness could position himself to become indispensable during the recovery period. The key was learning which secrets were valuable, which ones were dangerous, and which ones could be used to eliminate competitors. The methods eunuchs used to undermine each other were impressively creative. They might sabotage a rival's work by slightly mislaying important documents, ensuring that the rival would be blamed for inefficiency. They could spread carefully crafted rumors about a competitor's loyalty, knowing that even unfounded suspicions could be career-ending. In the paranoid atmosphere of the palace, the most sophisticated operators learned to manipulate their rivals into making mistakes, then appear to be trying to help while actually ensuring their downfall. Physical sabotage was also common, though it had to be subtle enough to avoid detection. A eunuch might add mild poison to a rival's food, not enough to kill, just enough to cause chronic illness that would make him appear unreliable. Or they might arrange for accidents to befall competitors. A loose floorboard here, a slippery step there, anything that could be explained as misfortune rather than malice. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more brutal. Eunuchs learned to identify each other's weaknesses and exploit them mercilessly. Someone who showed signs of depression might find himself assigned to increasingly degrading tasks until he broke down completely. A eunuch who'd formed an attachment to a particular imperial child might discover that his rival had poisoned that relationship with carefully planted suggestions about inappropriate behavior. Senior eunuchs developed elaborate networks of junior associates who functioned as their eyes and ears throughout the palace. These networks operated like intelligence agencies, gathering information about rival factions and planning coordinated attacks on competitors. The most successful eunuch leaders were those who could maintain loyalty from their subordinates while simultaneously betraying their peers, a psychological balancing act that would have impressed Machiavelli. The promotion system was deliberately opaque, which made the competition even more vicious. Eunuchs never knew exactly what criteria were being used to evaluate them, so they had to excel in every possible area while simultaneously undermining anyone who might be competing for the same advancement. This created a culture of paranoid overachievement where everyone was simultaneously trying to be perfect and trying to make everyone else look imperfect. Alliances between eunuchs were temporary and strategic, never based on genuine friendship or shared values. A eunuch might work closely with a colleague for months, sharing information and coordinating their efforts, then betray that same colleague the moment a better opportunity presented itself. Trust was a luxury that could literally be fatal in the eunuch hierarchy. The really successful eunuchs learned to play multiple sides simultaneously. They might appear to be loyal to one faction while secretly feeding information to another, positioning themselves to benefit regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. This required an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize their loyalties and maintain consistent deception across multiple relationships, skills that many eunuchs developed to a degree that would have impressed professional spies. What made this competition particularly toxic was that everyone involved understood they were fighting over scraps. Even the most successful eunuch remained fundamentally powerless, dependent on the whims of Imperial family members who could destroy them instantly. They were competing for the privilege of slightly better treatment within a system that considered them all expendable. It's like watching prisoners fight over who gets to sit closest to the executioner. The psychological cost of this constant competition was enormous. Eunuchs had to suppress any natural human tendencies toward cooperation, empathy, or genuine friendship. They learned to see every interaction as a potential trap, every colleague as a potential threat, and every piece of information as a weapon to be used against someone else. Many developed what we might now recognize as sociopathic traits, not because they were naturally cruel, but because cruelty had become necessary for survival. Some eunuchs tried to opt out of the competition entirely, accepting lower positions in exchange for reduced stress. But even this strategy had risks. Eunuchs who appeared to lack ambition were often seen as potential security threats, since their contentment might make them unreliable in crisis situations. The system was designed to ensure that no one could find peace within it. The few eunuchs who achieved genuine power often became the most ruthless of all, perhaps because they understood better than anyone how precarious their positions really were. They'd climbed over the bodies of their former colleagues to reach the top, and they knew that dozens of others were plotting to do the same thing to them. This created a cycle of escalating paranoia and preemptive strikes that made the upper levels of the eunuch hierarchy even more dangerous than the lower ones. The irony was that the system created exactly the kind of scheming, untrustworthy servants that it was supposedly designed to prevent. By castrating men to make them safer, then forcing them to compete ruthlessly for advancement, the Imperial system had created a bureaucracy of emasculated sociopaths who'd learned to weaponize their own victimization. And the truly horrifying part, many of them became genuinely good at it. They developed political skills that would have been impressive in any context, learned to manipulate complex social dynamics with surgical precision, and created networks of influence that could span multiple imperial administrations. They'd been broken by the system, then reforged into perfect instruments of that same system's perpetuation. The ladder they were climbing wasn't just made of bones. It was made of the bones of people exactly like themselves, people who'd started with the same dreams of advancement and ended up as stepping stones for the next generation of desperate climbers. So you've survived the castration, navigated the social death, mastered the palace politics, and climbed that gruesome ladder of bones to achieve something resembling success within this nightmare system. Congratulations, you're now important enough to be personally destroyed by the Emperor himself. Remember our bone ladder climber. He's about to discover that proximity to ultimate power means proximity to ultimate danger, where imperial moods swing faster than a drunken swordsman and twice as lethally. The relationship between successful eunuchs and the imperial family was perhaps the most psychologically complex dynamic in all of human history. These castrated men became intimate companions to the most powerful people on earth, privy to their deepest secrets and most vulnerable moments, while simultaneously remaining completely expendable. It's like being someone's best friend and their pet goldfish at the same time, cherished when convenient, disposable when not. Emperors often developed what appeared to be genuine affection for their eunuch companions. These relationships filled a unique psychological need for imperial rulers who couldn't trust anyone with normal motivations or intact sexuality. A eunuch couldn't seduce imperial women, couldn't father rival dynasties, and theoretically had no external loyalties that might conflict with imperial service. They were designed to be the perfect confidants, neutered enough to be safe, intelligent enough to be useful, and desperate enough to be completely loyal. But this apparent safety was an illusion, and both sides knew it. Emperors might share their deepest fears with favorite eunuchs, laugh at their jokes, and rely on their counsel, but they could also order their execution without legal process or social consequences. The intimacy was real, but it was the intimacy between a human and a beloved object, not between equals. And objects, no matter how treasured, can always be discarded when they become inconvenient. The most successful eunuchs learned to navigate this impossible relationship by becoming masters of emotional labor. They had to provide genuine companionship while never forgetting their expendable status, offer honest counsel while never threatening imperial ego, and maintain loyalty while understanding that loyalty would never be reciprocated. It required a level of psychological compartmentalization that would have impressed professional therapists. If professional therapists had existed in medieval China and specialized in treating castrated political survivors, imperial moods were notoriously unpredictable, and eunuchs bore the brunt of these emotional swings. An emperor might wake up in a good mood and shower his favorite eunuchs with gifts and privileges, then receive bad news at lunch and order the same eunuchs beaten for imagined slights. There was no logic to these mood swings, no way to predict them, and no protection from them. Eunuchs lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, monitoring their imperial masters for signs of changing, whether in their emotional climate, the palace gossip, networks that eunuchs had developed for their own advancement now became survival tools. Information about the emperor's health, his relationships with family members, his political concerns, and his personal obsessions could literally mean the difference between life and death. A eunuch who knew that the emperor was worried about a particular military campaign could avoid mentioning anything related to warfare. One who understood that the emperor was having problems with a specific concubine could steer conversations away from topics that might remind him of domestic difficulties, but knowledge could also be dangerous. Eunuchs who knew too much about imperial weaknesses, family scandals, or political mistakes might find themselves quietly eliminated to protect imperial dignity. The same information that made them valuable also made them threats. It's a peculiar form of job security where being too good at your job can get you killed. The execution of eunuchs was often swift and without warning. Unlike other court officials who might face formal charges and trials, eunuchs could be dragged away and killed based on nothing more than imperial whim. Their legal status was ambiguous enough that due process didn't really apply to them. They existed in a gray area between human and property that made their elimination administratively simple. Some emperors developed obsessions with particular eunuchs that were almost romantic in their intensity, though obviously not sexual. These relationships could elevate a eunuch to extraordinary heights of influence, but they also made him incredibly vulnerable to imperial disappointment. An emperor who discovered that his favorite eunuch had lied to him, failed him, or simply fallen short of impossible expectations might react with the fury of a lover betrayed. The punishment for disappointing an emotionally invested emperor was often far worse than death. The psychological dynamics became even more complex when emperors used eunuchs as emotional outlets for their own frustrations. A ruler who couldn't safely express anger at foreign ambassadors, military commanders, or family members could take out those frustrations on eunuchs who had no recourse and no protection. Eunuchs became human punching bags for imperial stress, absorbing violence and humiliation that couldn't be directed at more dangerous targets. Meanwhile, imperial family members often competed for the loyalty of successful eunuchs, creating additional layers of danger. A eunuch who became too closely associated with one prince might find himself in mortal danger if that prince fell out of favor, but refusing to align with any faction could be equally dangerous, since it might be interpreted as disloyalty to the imperial family as a whole. Eunuchs had to navigate these competing demands while never appearing to play favorites, even when playing favorites was essential for survival. The gift-giving culture around successful eunuchs was particularly twisted. Emperors would shower favorite eunuchs with expensive presents, silk robes, precious jewels, rare books, partly out of genuine affection, and partly as displays of imperial largesse. But these gifts came with invisible strings attached. A eunuch who accepted imperial generosity was expected to be proportionally grateful, and gratitude was measured by willingness to undertake increasingly dangerous or degrading tasks. Some eunuchs accumulated significant wealth through imperial favor, but this wealth was always precarious. Everything they owned technically belonged to the emperor and could be confiscated at any moment. Eunuchs learned to enjoy luxury while never becoming attached to it, to accept gifts while understanding they were temporary loans, and to display gratitude while maintaining emotional distance from material possessions. The retirement prospects for successful eunuchs were virtually non-existent. Unlike other court officials who might eventually return to their home provinces with honor and wealth, eunuchs had no home to return to and no family to support them in old age. They were trapped in palace service until death, dependent on imperial favor to maintain even basic living standards. Aging eunuchs who lost their usefulness often faced gradual reduction in status and privileges, a slow-motion execution that could last for years. Perhaps most cruelly, successful eunuchs were often required to train their own replacements. They had to pass on their skills, their knowledge, and their carefully cultivated relationships to younger eunuchs who might eventually replace them entirely. It's hard to imagine a more psychologically brutal arrangement than being forced to mentor your own obsolescence. The loneliness of successful eunuchs was profound and unique. They were surrounded by people, but trusted by none and trusting of none. Their relationships with emperors were based on utility rather than genuine affection. Their relationships with other eunuchs were compromised by competition and survival instincts. They existed in a bubble of artificial intimacy with the most powerful people in China, while being fundamentally isolated from genuine human connection. And yet, many of them adapted to this impossible situation with a resilience that was almost superhuman. They learned to find meaning in their service, satisfaction in their competence, and even moments of genuine happiness in their relationships with imperial family members. They created lives of purpose within systems designed to deny them personhood, found dignity in circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate dignity entirely. The emperor's disposable companions had achieved the ultimate success within their constrained world, but success had only revealed new depths of vulnerability and new forms of psychological torture. They'd climbed to the top of their particular mountain, only to discover it was actually the rim of a volcano that could erupt at any moment, and the eruption, when it came, could destroy them in ways that made their original castration seem almost gentle by comparison. Let's talk about what that rusty blade actually did to the human body, because the physical castration was just the opening act in a lifelong medical horror show that would make modern endocrinologists weep into their textbooks. Remember our imperial companion who'd learned to dance around volcanic imperial moods. He's been dealing with the cascading biological consequences of childhood castration for decades now, and his body has some very unpleasant surprises in store. Castration before puberty doesn't just remove reproductive organs, it fundamentally rewrites the entire script of human development. The hormones that those missing parts would have produced were supposed to orchestrate everything from bone density to muscle mass, from voice development to cardiovascular health. Remove the conductors, and the entire biological orchestra starts playing discordant notes that get worse with every passing year. The most immediately obvious change was skeletal development. Eunuchs grew unusually tall because their growth plates never received the hormonal signals to stop growing. But this height came at a terrible cost. Their bones remained thin and brittle, never developing the density that testosterone would have provided. A 40-year-old eunuch might have the bone strength of a 70-year-old woman, prone to fractures from minor falls and chronic pain from vertebrae that couldn't support their elongated frames. Their limbs grew disproportionately long, creating an uncanny appearance that made everyone uncomfortable without quite understanding why. These weren't the proportions of normal human development. They were the proportions of interrupted development, bodies that had been frozen in an adolescent growth pattern while continuing to age. Walking through the palace, eunuchs looked like elegant scarecrows dressed in silk, their movements graceful, but somehow wrong in ways that triggered instinctive unease in observers. The cardiovascular system suffered tremendously from hormonal disruption. Without testosterone to maintain muscle mass and regulate blood pressure, many eunuchs developed heart problems that were poorly understood by medieval medicine. They were prone to irregular heartbeats, chronic fatigue, and sudden cardiac episodes that could kill them without warning. Palace physicians had no effective treatments for these conditions, so eunuchs simply learned to live with the constant possibility that their hearts might stop functioning during routine activities. Metabolism became a constant struggle. Eunuchs tended to gain weight easily, but in strange patterns, accumulating fat around their hips and thighs like women, but without the hormonal regulation that would have made this distribution healthy. They often developed what we would now recognize as metabolic syndrome, with chronically elevated blood sugar and insulin resistance that left them perpetually tired and prone to infections that healed slowly. The skin changes were particularly unsettling. Eunuch skin remained soft and hairless, but it also became fragile and slow to heal. Minor cuts could become serious infections, and bruises lingered for weeks. Their complexions took on a peculiar pallor that wasn't quite masculine or feminine, but something eerily in between. Palace cosmetics couldn't quite disguise this otherworldly quality, which may have been part of why eunuchs made everyone so uncomfortable. Psychologically, the hormonal disruption created problems that had no name in medieval Chinese medicine. What we might now recognize as chronic depression was endemic among eunuchs, but it manifested in ways that were poorly understood. They experienced persistent mood swings, difficulty concentrating, and a peculiar emotional flatness that alternated with periods of intense anxiety. Many developed what we would now call dissociative episodes, periods where they seemed to disconnect from their own experiences as a psychological defense mechanism. The sleep disorders were particularly cruel. Many eunuchs suffered from chronic insomnia, lying awake for hours while their minds raced through the endless calculations required for palace survival. Others experienced hypersomnia, sleeping for 12 or 14 hours, but never feeling rested. The palace schedule didn't accommodate these biological needs, so eunuchs learned to function on whatever rest they could manage while maintaining the appearance of constant availability. Memory problems became more severe with age. Eunuchs who had been intellectually sharp in their youth often experienced premature cognitive decline, forgetting names, faces, and important details that could be dangerous to misremember in palace politics. Some historians speculate that this cognitive decline was actually a psychological defense mechanism, a way for traumatized minds to forget experiences too painful to remember consciously. The digestive system was another casualty of hormonal disruption. Many eunuchs developed chronic stomach problems, inability to digest certain foods, and unpredictable bowel issues that were both physically uncomfortable and socially humiliating. Palace life required them to maintain perfect composure during long ceremonies and formal events, regardless of what their bodies were doing internally. Sexual development, or rather the lack thereof, created a unique form of psychological trauma that had no precedent in normal human experience. These men had been castrated before understanding what they were losing, then spent decades watching other people experience desires and satisfactions that remained forever mysterious to them. They knew intellectually what they were missing, but they couldn't feel the absence in any concrete way, which created a peculiar form of existential confusion. Some eunuchs reported phantom sensations in their missing parts, similar to what amputees experience with lost limbs. These phantom pains could be intensely uncomfortable and impossible to treat, since the source of the discomfort no longer existed. Palace physicians had no understanding of neurological phantom pain, so eunuchs suffering from these symptoms were often dismissed as malingerers or attention seekers. The voice changes created ongoing social problems. Eunuch voices remained high and childlike throughout their adult lives, but not in a pleasant way, more like an adult man doing a poor imitation of a child's voice. This vocal quality made it difficult for them to be taken seriously in administrative roles and added to the general sense of unease that people felt around them. They could never sound authoritative or masculine, regardless of their actual competence or intelligence. Temperature regulation became problematic as eunuchs aged. Without normal hormonal regulation, many experienced chronic coldness that no amount of clothing could alleviate. Palace heating was minimal, and eunuchs often suffered through winter months in a state of constant shivering that affected their ability to perform detailed work with their hands. The immune system weakened progressively, making eunuchs susceptible to illnesses that wouldn't have seriously affected normal adults. Minor respiratory infections could develop into life-threatening pneumonia. Skin conditions that would have been temporary nuisances became chronic problems. Even successful eunuchs lived with the constant awareness that their bodies were failing them in ways they couldn't control or prevent. Mental health deteriorated in predictable patterns. Many eunuchs developed what we would now recognize as complex PTSD, with intrusive memories of their castration, hypervigilance about threats to their safety, and emotional numbing that made genuine relationships nearly impossible. But they had to hide these symptoms completely, since displaying psychological weakness could be fatal in palace politics. Some eunuchs turned to alcohol or opium to manage their physical and psychological pain, but substance abuse created additional problems in an environment where mental clarity was essential for survival. Others developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors, elaborate ritual behaviors that gave them some sense of control over their chaotic internal experiences. The aging process was particularly cruel to eunuchs. Without testosterone to maintain muscle mass and bone density, they became frail earlier than normal men. But they couldn't retire from palace service, so they had to continue performing demanding physical and mental tasks with bodies that were failing them systematically. Many spent their final years as walking medical disasters, held together by willpower and palace medicine that was more ritual than effective treatment. Perhaps most tragically, the medical problems that plagued eunuchs were largely invisible to the people around them. Their suffering was private. Their symptoms were poorly understood, and their pain was considered irrelevant to their function as palace servants. They endured decades of chronic illness and psychological trauma while maintaining the appearance of perfect health and emotional stability. The rusty blade had taken more than their reproductive organs. It had stolen their entire biological future, condemning them to lives of progressive physical deterioration and psychological fragmentation that began in childhood and continued until death. And they were expected to be grateful for the privilege that he will spend his entire life fundamentally alone, unable to form the basic human connections that give life meaning and purpose. Imagine trying to explain your existence to someone from a normal life. Well, I was castrated as a child, sold to the Imperial palace, and now I serve people who consider me a useful object rather than a human being. I can't marry, can't have children, can't even maintain friendships, because everyone I know is either a competitor trying to destroy me or a superior who might order my execution. But other than that, how was your day? It's not exactly the foundation for meaningful social interaction. The gender confusion was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of eunuch identity. Chinese society had very clear categories for men and women, with specific roles, expectations, and social positions for each. Eunuchs fit neither category, creating a cognitive dissonance that made everyone uncomfortable, including the eunuchs themselves. They weren't men because they lacked the physical equipment and social roles that defined masculinity. But they weren't women either, lacking the biological functions and social positions that defined femininity. This ambiguity created practical problems in every social interaction. How should other people address a eunuch? What pronouns should be used? What social courtesies were appropriate? The uncertainty made everyone nervous, leading to awkward conversations and stilted relationships that never developed beyond the most superficial level. Eunuchs became accustomed to seeing people's expressions shift when they realized what they were dealing with, a subtle but unmistakable change from normal social engagement to careful, distant politeness. The clothing restrictions reinforced their liminal status. Eunuchs were required to dress in ways that clearly marked their ambiguous gender identity. Not quite masculine garments, but not feminine either. Their robes were cut differently from normal men's clothing. Their accessories were regulated, and even their hairstyles were prescribed to maintain their status as human curiosities. They were walking advertisements for their own castration, constantly reminded of their difference and unable to blend into normal society even for a moment. Marriage was obviously impossible, but this created more than just sexual frustration. It eliminated the entire social structure that gave meaning to most people's lives. Chinese society was organized around family relationships: son to father, husband to wife, father to children. These relationships provided identity, purpose, and social connection. Eunuchs were excluded from all of them, floating through life without the anchors that kept other people psychologically stable. The absence of romantic relationships was particularly cruel because eunuchs retained the human need for intimate connection even after losing the biological drives that usually motivate such relationships. They could form intense emotional attachments to other people, but these relationships were always constrained by their social status and the practical realities of palace life. A eunuch might develop deep feelings for another person, but those feelings could never be fully expressed or reciprocated within the normal frameworks of human romance. Some eunuchs formed close relationships with imperial women, bonds that resembled intimate friendships, but were always shadowed by the reality of the eunuch's castration. These relationships could be emotionally satisfying for both parties. The imperial women gained confidants who posed no sexual threat, while the eunuchs experienced something approaching normal human intimacy. But these bonds were also dangerous, since they could be misinterpreted by suspicious observers as inappropriate or politically motivated. The relationship between eunuchs and normal men was particularly complex. Eunuchs often served as intermediaries between the masculine world of court politics and the feminine world of the inner palace, but this role left them trusted by neither side. Regular men often viewed eunuchs with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing them as failures of masculinity who'd surrendered their manhood for palace privileges. The fact that many eunuchs achieved significant power and influence only intensified this resentment. Friendships between eunuchs were possible, but complicated by the competitive nature of palace life. Two eunuchs might genuinely care for each other, but they also understood that their survival might eventually require betraying that friendship. The bonds between eunuchs often resembled the relationships between prisoners of war, intense but temporary, based on shared suffering rather than genuine compatibility. Absence of children was perhaps the most profound loss, the one that eunuchs couldn't fully comprehend since they'd been castrated before understanding what parenthood meant. They watched other people's children grow up, served imperial families, and witnessed the joys and sorrows of parental relationships without ever experiencing them directly. Some eunuchs developed quasi-parental relationships with younger eunuchs, but these bonds were always constrained by the hierarchical nature of palace life. The psychological adaptation to permanent childlessness required eunuchs to develop alternative sources of meaning and purpose. Some became obsessed with accumulating knowledge, creating elaborate libraries, or becoming experts in particular fields. Others channeled their protective instincts into service to the imperial family, treating the emperor's children as surrogate offspring. But these substitutes never fully addressed the fundamental human need to create and nurture new life. Religious life offered some consolation, but even here eunuchs faced discrimination. Many Buddhist and Taoist monasteries refused to accept eunuchs, considering their castration a form of self-mutilation that violated religious principles. The eunuchs who did find acceptance in religious communities often discovered that their past lives made normal spiritual development difficult. Meditation was complicated by intrusive memories, and the peace that religion promised remained elusive. The aging process was particularly cruel for eunuchs because they had no family support systems to ease their decline. Normal men could expect their wives and children to care for them in old age, but eunuchs faced the prospect of dying alone, attended only by younger eunuchs who were themselves trapped in the same system. The knowledge that they would leave no legacy, no descendants to remember them, and no family to mourn their passing added an extra layer of despair to their final years. Some eunuchs attempted to create artificial family structures, adopting street children or forming quasi-familial bonds with other palace servants. But these relationships were always precarious, subject to the political winds that could separate people without warning. A eunuch might invest years in nurturing a relationship with a young servant, only to have that person reassigned to different duties or eliminated entirely due to palace intrigue. The sexual dimension of eunuch loneliness was complex and poorly understood even by the eunuchs themselves. They retained the human need for physical intimacy and emotional connection, but lacked the biological drives that usually motivated such relationships. Some eunuchs reported experiencing something like sexual desire, but without the physical capacity to act on those feelings. Others described a complete absence of sexual interest that left them feeling disconnected from a fundamental aspect of human experience. The social rituals around sexuality were particularly painful for eunuchs. They attended weddings, observed courtship behaviors, and listened to conversations about romantic relationships. While being permanently excluded from these experiences, they became experts in the mechanics of human sexuality through their palace duties, but remained forever outsiders to the emotional and physical realities of intimate relationships. Perhaps most tragically, many eunuchs spent their entire adult lives wondering what they might have been if they'd never been castrated. They carried within themselves ghost versions of their potential selves, the men they might have become, the families they might have raised, the normal lives they might have lived. These phantom identities haunted them constantly, creating a form of chronic grief for lives that had never existed. The loneliness of eunuchs was absolute in ways that even other isolated people couldn't fully understand. They were surrounded by people, but connected to none, valued for their utility, but not for their humanity, observed constantly, but never truly seen. They lived in a state of permanent psychological exile, citizens of a country that existed only in the margins between normal human categories. And yet, somehow, many of them found ways to create meaning within this impossible isolation. They developed internal resources that allowed them to survive decades of profound loneliness. They learned to find satisfaction in their competence, purpose in their service, and even moments of genuine connection, despite the constraints of their situation. But the price of this adaptation was the gradual extinction of their authentic selves, replaced by perfectly functional servants who had learned to live without the human connections that make life worth living. The final phase of their journey was approaching, and it would prove that even death offered no escape from the systematic dehumanization that had defined their entire existence. Death, which most people consider the great equalizer, turned out to be just another opportunity for Chinese society to remind eunuchs that they didn't quite qualify as fully human. Remember our profoundly lonely palace survivor. He's about to discover that the systematic dehumanization that defined his life would continue even after his last breath, ensuring that his final humiliation would be as complete as all the others. The approach of death held unique terrors for eunuchs. that normal people couldn't comprehend, while other men faced mortality with the comfort of knowing they'd leave behind children, family names, and some form of continuing legacy. Eunuchs confronted the absolute finality of their existence. They would die as they had lived, disconnected from the great chain of human continuity that gave meaning to individual mortality. Chinese culture placed enormous emphasis on ancestral reverence and family continuity. A man's death was meaningful because it represented his transition from active participant to revered ancestor, someone whose memory would be honored by descendants for generations. But eunuchs had no descendants to honor them, no family altars where their spirits would be welcomed, and no place in the elaborate Chinese conception of afterlife that was so deeply connected to family relationships. The practical arrangements for dying eunuchs revealed the depth of their social isolation. When a normal palace official became ill, his family would be notified, arrangements would be made for his care, and preparations would begin for appropriate funeral ceremonies. When a eunuch fell ill, he became a logistical problem to be managed by palace administrators who were primarily concerned with minimizing disruption to palace operations. Medical care for dying eunuchs was perfunctory at best. Palace physicians might make token efforts to treat their illnesses, but everyone understood that eunuchs were essentially replaceable. The same resources that would be devoted to saving a normal court official were considered wasted on someone with no family connections and no independent social value. Many eunuchs died from treatable conditions simply because no one considered their lives worth the expense of proper medical attention. The deathbed experience for eunuchs was uniquely desolate. While normal men might be surrounded by wives, children, and close friends during their final moments, eunuchs typically died alone or attended only by other eunuchs who were themselves too emotionally damaged to provide genuine comfort. The absence of family members to hold their hands, whisper final words of love, or perform the small rituals of comfort that ease the transition from life to death made their final moments as lonely as everything else in their existence. Perhaps most cruelly, dying eunuchs were often expected to continue their duties almost until the moment of death. Palace schedules didn't accommodate personal illness, and eunuchs who appeared to be malingering faced punishment that could hasten their actual death. Many eunuchs worked through their final illnesses, dragging themselves through palace corridors to perform their duties, while their bodies systematically shut down. The moment of death brought no relief from bureaucratic indifference, while the death of a normal court official triggered elaborate administrative procedures, notifications to family, arrangements for body transport, coordination with funeral directors. The death of a eunuch was recorded in ledgers alongside other routine palace transactions. They became inventory items to be disposed of efficiently rather than human beings whose passing merited ceremony or mourning. The treatment of eunuch corpses revealed the full extent of their dehumanization. Chinese funeral practices were elaborate and meaningful, designed to honor the deceased and ensure their proper transition to the afterlife. Bodies were carefully prepared, dressed in appropriate clothing, and presented to family members for final farewells. But eunuch corpses were handled like medical waste, prepared by palace servants who had no emotional connection to the deceased and no investment in treating the body with dignity. The absence of family members to claim the body created additional humiliations. Normal corpses were released to relatives who would arrange appropriate funerals, but eunuch bodies remained palace property even after death. They were disposed of according to palace convenience rather than religious custom or personal preference. Many were buried in unmarked graves in palace cemeteries that served more as disposal sites than places of rest. The funeral ceremonies for eunuchs, when they occurred at all, were perfunctory affairs that emphasized their servitude rather than their humanity. While normal funerals celebrated the life and achievements of the deceased, eunuch funerals focused on their loyal service to the imperial family. Even in death, they were defined by their utility rather than their personhood, remembered as functions rather than individuals. The question of posthumous honors revealed another layer of discrimination. Successful court officials might receive posthumous titles, have their names inscribed on memorial tablets, or be remembered in official histories. But eunuch achievements were typically attributed to the imperial family members. They served rather than to the eunuchs themselves. Their contributions to palace administration, their political insights, and their years of faithful service disappeared into the larger narrative of imperial accomplishment. Some eunuchs attempted to create their own memorial arrangements, using their accumulated wealth to commission tombstones or fund modest funeral ceremonies. But these efforts were often frustrated by legal restrictions that limited eunuch property rights and social customs that discouraged elaborate memorialization of castrated servants. Even their attempts to ensure dignified burials were constrained by the same system that had controlled their lives. The rare eunuchs who achieved genuine historical significance faced unique challenges in how they would be remembered. Official historians were reluctant to give too much credit to eunuchs, since acknowledging their importance might suggest that the imperial system was dependent on castrated servants. The historical record was systematically sanitized to minimize eunuch contributions and emphasize their proper subordination to imperial authority. Religious communities that might have provided spiritual comfort to dying eunuchs were often hostile or indifferent to their plight. Buddhist and Taoist funeral practices were designed for normal family structures, with rituals that assumed the deceased had lived complete human lives. Eunuchs didn't fit these templates, creating theological problems that most religious officials solved by simply excluding them from normal funeral services. The psychological preparation for death was particularly difficult for eunuchs because they had to confront their mortality without the normal human consolations. They couldn't find comfort in thoughts of their children carrying on their legacy, couldn't imagine their spouses honoring their memory, and couldn't anticipate the family gatherings where their stories would be told to future generations. They faced death as they had faced life, alone and disconnected from the human community. Some eunuchs developed elaborate personal philosophies to cope with their approaching mortality, drawing on Buddhist concepts of impermanence or Taoist notions of natural cycles. But these intellectual frameworks couldn't fully address the emotional reality of dying without having truly lived, of leaving no trace that their existence had mattered to final indignity came with the disposal of their personal possessions. While normal people's belongings were distributed to family members according to established customs, eunuch possessions typically reverted to palace ownership. Their books, their clothing, their small treasures and mementos were redistributed to other servants or sold to cover the costs of their disposal. Nothing remained to suggest that a particular individual had once lived, worked, and suffered in those palace quarters. The graves of eunuchs, when they could be located at all, were typically unmarked and unmaintained. Without family members to tend them, these burial sites quickly became overgrown and forgotten. Within a generation, there was often no physical evidence that particular eunuchs had ever existed. They achieved in death the complete invisibility that palace life had trained them to cultivate while living. Perhaps most tragically, the death of a eunuch was often seen as a relief by the palace community rather than a loss. Their passing reduced administrative burdens, freed up living quarters for new servants, and eliminated potential sources of political complication. They were mourned by no one and missed by few, their absence noted primarily in duty rosters that needed to be adjusted. The few eunuchs who managed to maintain some human connections during their lives discovered that even these tenuous relationships couldn't survive their death. Other eunuchs were too focused on their own survival to waste time grieving for colleagues, and imperial family members who had seemed fond of particular eunuchs quickly forgot them once they were no longer useful. Death had denied them even the basic human dignity of being properly mourned, remembered, and honored. They had lived as ghosts and died as ghosts, their existence so thoroughly erased that it was as if they had never been born at all. But understanding why anyone would choose this fate and why the system persisted for centuries requires examining the broader context of power and desperation that made the eunuch system seem rational to the people who created and maintained it. So here we are, at the end of this rather dark journey through Imperial China's most peculiar career path. You've witnessed the blade, the blood, the desperate climb up palace hierarchies slick with ambition and fear. You've seen men transform themselves into something else entirely, neither fully male nor female, neither truly free nor completely enslaved, all for a chance at power that might never come. And yet, despite everything we've explored, despite the mutilation and humiliation and constant threat of death, men kept volunteering for this fate, which raises the obvious question: what kind of society creates conditions so desperate that castration seems like a reasonable career move? The answer lies in understanding just how crushing poverty could be in Imperial China, and how tantalizing the palace's promises appeared from the outside. For a peasant family watching their crops fail for the third year running, selling a son into eunuch service wasn't cruelty. It was mathematics. One less mouth to feed, plus whatever payment the palace recruiters offered, plus the slim but real possibility that their boy might someday send gold home from his position of power. It was a lottery ticket bought with flesh, and in a world where most people died exactly where they were born, even the longest odds looked appealing. Consider the merchant families. 2. Those who'd made enough money to taste prosperity, but not enough to guarantee it would last. They watched the scholar officials with their hereditary advantages, their networks of influence, their seemingly unshakable positions in the bureaucracy. But the eunuch path, that was merit-based, in its own twisted way. A clever boy with quick reflexes and a strong stomach could theoretically rise higher than any number of classically educated sons of gentlemen. The palace didn't care about your ancestry if you could navigate its labyrinthine politics and survive its casual brutalities. The eunuchs themselves understood this calculation perfectly, which is why so many of them accumulated vast personal wealth. They weren't just hoarding treasure for its own sake. They were building safety nets, creating the kind of financial security that made their sacrifice feel worthwhile. A successful eunuch could support dozens of relatives, could lift his entire extended family out of poverty with a single well-timed bribe or cleverly negotiated trade agreement. The irony was exquisite. Men who'd given up the possibility of biological heirs often ended up supporting more people than any traditional paterfamilias ever could. But let's not romanticize this arrangement. The eunuch system persisted because it served the emperor's needs perfectly, not because it was kind to anyone involved. By creating a class of men who could never establish dynasties of their own, never pass down accumulated power to biological sons, the imperial system had invented the perfect servants. Eunuchs could become incredibly influential without becoming genuinely threatening to the throne. Their power died with them, reverting back to the emperor like some sort of feudal loan that could never be made permanent. This explains why emperors often preferred eunuch advisors to regular officials, despite the constant complaints from Confucian scholars about corruption and incompetence in the palace. A eunuch grand secretary might embezzle funds and accept bribes, and generally behave like the worst kind of politician, but he'd never declare himself emperor. He'd never rally the provinces behind his own banner or marry his daughters into rival royal houses. His ambitions were necessarily limited, contained within the palace walls by the very mutilation that had granted him access to power in the first place. The scholarly class never tired of pointing this out, of course. Confucian officials wrote endless memorials condemning eunuch influence as a corruption of proper governance, a violation of natural hierarchies that placed educated gentlemen at the top of the administrative pyramid. They had a point. Eunuch power did tend to destabilize traditional bureaucratic norms, creating alternative channels of influence that bypassed the examination system entirely. But their criticism missed the deeper logic at work. The emperor didn't want a perfectly rational, merit-based bureaucracy staffed by incorruptible scholar officials. He wanted a system he could control, and eunuchs were infinitely more controllable than ambitious young men with intact genitals and dynastic dreams. This is where the true horror of the eunuch system reveals itself, not in the individual suffering it caused, though that was real enough, but in what it represented about Imperial Chinese society as a whole. Here was a civilization sophisticated enough to develop gunpowder and paper money and intricate philosophical systems, yet it built its governance around the systematic mutilation of children. It created conditions so harsh that parents would sell their sons into sexual slavery, then called the whole arrangement a form of social mobility. It was cruelty masquerading as opportunity, violence dressed up as bureaucratic necessity. Eunuchs themselves seemed to understand this contradiction, which might explain why so many of them became notorious for their own cruelty. Once they achieved positions of authority, they'd been shaped by a system that treated human beings as expendable resources. So perhaps it's not surprising that they learned to treat others the same way. The palace had taught them that suffering was simply the price of advancement, that dignity was a luxury that powerful people couldn't afford to extend to their inferiors. They applied these lessons with the thoroughness of dedicated students, and still, right up until the end of the imperial system in 1912, young men kept presenting themselves at palace gates, hoping to exchange their manhood for a chance at influence. The last generation of eunuchs served the final Qing emperors, watching their world collapse around them as foreign powers carved up China and revolutionary movements promised to sweep away the old order entirely. Some of them lived to see the People's Republic established, ancient men carrying the scars of a system that had already become incomprehensible to younger generations. What strikes you, perhaps, is how little this history gets discussed in popular accounts of Imperial China. We hear about the Great Wall and the Silk Road, about poets and painters, and the wisdom of ancient philosophers, but the eunuchs remain largely invisible, relegated to footnotes and specialized academic studies, as if their story is too uncomfortable to integrate into broader narratives about Chinese civilization. But their invisibility is part of the point. The eunuch system worked precisely because it created people who could wield enormous influence while remaining fundamentally disposable, whose power was always temporary, and whose suffering could be easily ignored. Perhaps that's the most unsettling realization of all, that the eunuch system wasn't an aberration or a historical accident, but a logical extension of Imperial China's basic approach to governance. It was what happened when you took the principle of absolute imperial authority to its natural conclusion, when you decided that human dignity was less important than administrative efficiency. The men who submitted to castration weren't victims of some ancient barbarity we've thankfully left behind. They were products of a rational system that had calculated the precise value of human suffering and decided it was an acceptable cost of doing business. So as we reach the end of this rather grim tale, you might find yourself wondering what lessons it holds for our own time, our own societies that create their own forms of institutionalized cruelty while maintaining comfortable myths about progress and civilization. But those are thoughts for another night, another story. For now, let the images fade, the palace courtyards and surgical knives, the desperate families and ambitious young men, and allow yourself to drift toward whatever dreams await you in the darkness ahead. And so we close the book on this particular chapter of human history, though the echoes linger in the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking. You've traveled through centuries of ambition and desperation, witnessed the strange mathematics of power that convinced thousands of young men that mutilation was a reasonable price for influence. You've seen how cruelty can dress itself up as opportunity, how systems can perpetuate themselves by convincing their victims they're actually beneficiaries. But perhaps, in the end, what matters most is that you've looked directly at this darkness without flinching, that you've allowed yourself to understand how easily civilizations can normalize the unthinkable. These stories matter not because they're exotic or distant, but because they reveal the patterns that repeat themselves across cultures and centuries. The way power always finds new ways to extract sacrifices from those who seek it. The way societies learn to make their cruelties invisible to themselves. Let these images settle now, like dust on ancient palace floors. Let the weight of all that history dissolve into the comfortable darkness around you. You've come so far tonight, through such strange and difficult territory, and now it's time to let go completely. The past has shared its secrets, and you've listened with the patience of a true student of history. Rest now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow the present moment to reclaim you gently, warmly, as you drift toward whatever peaceful dreams await you in the hours ahead.